Good morning. Today's date is March 20th, 2007. My name is Richard Nicholas. Today I am conducting an oral history interview with James Scullary for the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Dalton Council on Aging. This interview is being held at the Dalton Community Television Studio in Dalton, Massachusetts. Good morning, Jim.
Morning.
Jim, would you please state your full name, and also would you please spell your last name?
James Joseph Scullary, Scullary.
And where do you presently live?
36 Morwood Drive, Pittsfield, Mass.
And could you tell us your date of birth and where you were born?
I was born in Pittsfield on October 9th, 1918.
Did you grow up and go to school in Pittsfield?
I did.
And could you tell us where you lived and what schools you went to?
Well, I remember living on East Street, and I went to Plunkett School and Hibbert School and Pittsfield High School. I graduated from there.
Okay. And what was it like growing up in the Depression in Pittsfield at that time?
Well,
I remember we had talked about push carts being...
seemed like I can remember we had to go out, pick berries, and we had a garden, and had to till the soil by hand and plant whatever we could get our hands on, tomatoes and cucumbers and squash and beans, and it was a little tight, but we managed fine.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any brothers or sisters, Jim?
I have one brother and two sisters.
And where did you stand in that order?
I was the oldest.
And your dad, what did he do for a living?
He worked at General Electric in the plastic division.
And you mentioned high school. When did you graduate from high school, Jim?
1937. I was in a winter class. Graduated in January. 1937.
I understand that you had a special honor when you graduated.
Yeah, I received the first Tommy Curtin Medal for achievement in scholastics and athletics.
Okay, Jim, if you look at the screen over there, you can see it. Can you describe the medal to us and perhaps who Tommy Curtin was?
It's a gold medal. It has a likeness of Tommy Curtin on one side, and my name is engraved on the other side.
Who was Thomas Curtin?
Tommy Curtin was a star player for Yale University. His father owned the optometry shop on North Street at the time.
Now, this medal was awarded for scholastic as well as athletic achievements?
It was.
Okay. And I understand at the assembly there was a little
Well, when they had the assembly, the jeweler had not finished engraving the medal, and so they handed me what appeared to be a silver dollar to take the place of the medal that wasn't there. And I think it was later the next week that I got the medal itself. I've had it ever since, tucked away in a corner.
That's quite an honor. Now, you mentioned that it was for scholastic achievement too. And what sports did you play, Jim, in high school?
Basketball, football, and track. Set a record in a pole vault that lasted for about 20 years. And
and that's a little different equipment than what they're using today, huh?
Well, I noticed, I look at the track meet results of high school and college, And I noticed there are not many people pole vaulting these days. I don't blame them.
Right. And after high school, after you graduated, what did you do, Jim?
I went to work at the transformer division of General Electric from about 5 days after I graduated from high school till about September. And then I had hoped to have gone to college, but there was some kind of a mix-up, and I think I went to work for what was then called a Double Dip on First Street, ice cream parlor.
Right.
And I worked there until the next summer when I did get admitted to Williams.
And you eventually did continue your education. Could you tell us how you got into Williams?
Well, there were a group of Italian professionals who were trying to figure out how to get me to school, and some of them wanted me to go to Williams, and others wanted me to go to Union in New York, and finally time passed and I didn't go anyplace, so Dr. Anthony Masmiano, who was then our family doctor, he took matters in his own hands and brought me up to Williams and introduced me to Dean Keller, and they decided to give me a full tuition scholarship and gave me some jobs so that I could afford this room and board and all that stuff. And
Did you play sports at Williams?
yeah, I played track and football. I wasn't getting enough sleep to play basketball too. So,
With the jobs.
yeah,
Okay. Now, did you leave Williams before graduating?
I did when I was talking to the professors and seeing what was going on in Europe. Some of us decided that we either had to do our graduation work right away or we weren't going to get a chance to do it. So I wound up going to law school right after leaving Williams
Where did you go there, Jim?
at Boston University Law School, and I was there until May of 1941. And then I decided I was going to join the Air Force.
Now, you took a physical for the Air Force in June.
Westover Field, I remember, was an all-day physical, and at the end of the day, they said they couldn't pass me because I had a deviated septum, and I asked them, well, what'll I do? And they said, you have to get it operated on and then come back, which is just what I did. I came home, got it operated on, went back to Westover, and they cleared me, and that was probably September of 41.
Mm-hmm.
Then indicated I would hear from them.
And did you hear from them?
I heard from them on the 5th of December, 41, when I was told I had for Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama.
Now, this was 2 days before Pearl Harbor.
Yep.
How did you feel about this when Pearl Harbor happened?
Well, I figured now I'm ready to go. We're in a war, so I figured I would do whatever I had to do.
You told me an interesting story about this time about your mother and father.
Oh yeah, they old country people who felt that once I got ordered to go that I was forever gone because they figured the war. And the background for that, I think, was that my father had a brother who died in World War I. So you could understand why they thought the way they did. They got rid of all my clothes, figuring I was never coming back. So fortunately, I fooled them.
You fooled them. What were your dates of service, Jim? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think January 7th, 42 to February 14th, 46.
Right. Now, you mentioned Maxwell Field. That's where you went for your basic training?
Right, that was my first assignment. I'm trying to remember whether I got sworn in Springfield and got on a train then and headed for Maxwell, or whether I got sworn in Maxwell. I think I got sworn in Springfield.
Were you in a group, or were you traveling alone?
No, I was alone.
And what type of training did you receive here at Maxwell?
At Maxwell, we get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, do cross country and then calisthenics, and we go in the class to learn about latitude and longitude and things connected with the Air Force, meteorology. I think I had about 60 hours of.
Now, what was your title here in basic?
Aviation Cadet.
And you had little different uniforms too?
Well, they let us wear white shirts with black ties and uniforms.
In addition to the regular uniform?
No, that's the regular
was the
uniform.
regular. Sorry.
Instead of having a khaki shirt,
I see.
we had a white shirt and a black tie. So we stood out.
Well, you guys were special. How long was basic training, Jim?
I'm trying to remember when I left Maxwell to go to Ocala, Florida for flight training.
Okay, but probably around 10 weeks, you said earlier, I think.
Somewhere around there. I don't remember exactly. But went to Ocala, and I thought I was going to wind up being a pilot, but after being there for a while, there were 90 of us in the class, and orders came down, evidently, to send some of us back to Maxwell to be trained as either navigators or bombardiers.
Okay.
So.
Now, did you do any flying at this time while you were at Ocala?
Yeah, did maybe, I forget how many hours, at least a dozen hours of flight training, flying. And when the orders came through to send us back to Maxwell, there was a lot of griping about it, but we went back, and then they assigned us to Monroe, Louisiana.
Okay, before you went there, while you were still at Ocala, you met someone famous, didn't you? A general?
Hap Arnold, General Hap Arnold. I think he was the head of the Air Force.
Okay. And now you mentioned you went to Monroe, Louisiana. And what type of training and schooling did you get here?
Well, there you had both flight and classroom. And you did the same. They kept you doing a lot of calisthenics and kept you in shape. And had all kinds of classroom time, and we used to go on flights all over the country so that we would test our navigation skills to see how fast we were assimilating the navigation terms. So that went on until I think I went there in May of '42, graduated in October, got my commission then, October.
What type of planes were you training in here?
They were, I don't know, AT-7s and twin-engine airplanes that had maybe 3, 4 students navigating.
Now, while you were at Monroe, did you get a furlough at this time?
I think I did, but I don't remember just when. I think it was in September of '42. I got a furlough. That's when I came back to Pittsfield and my wife proposed to me.
Very, very good. And after that, did you return to Monroe?
I think so. I think I did go back to Monroe because I went from Monroe to Avon Park to Fort Myers.
Okay. Now you mentioned that at Monroe, you received your commission. Is that correct? And what rank did you receive?
Second lieutenant.
And what was your title at that time?
Lieutenant.
No, I mean you were a navigator.
Yeah, I was a
full-fledged?
navigator.
Okay. And what was that date? Do you remember? Because you said that.
October 24th, 1942, I got my wings and my commission.
And there was an unusual thing happened later on that same date, right?
My son, 25 years to the day, got his commission.
That's great.
In the Army Engineers.
That's great.
25 years.
Now, where did you go next after Monroe? You mentioned Avon Park.
Well, our order said to go to Avon Park. And a bunch of us, one of the guys had a car, so we drove from Monroe across Mississippi and Alabama and into Florida, and we went to Avon Park, and there was nothing there. It was a bombing site they were using, but no barracks, nothing. A hangar was there. So we talked to somebody there, and they said, "Oh, you guys got to go to Fort Myers." So we went to Fort Myers, and that's where we started to fly in B-26s.
And could you describe the B-26s a little bit?
Well, it was a fast airplane. It had a bad reputation because a lot of the pilots were afraid of flying it because unless you really knew what you were doing, the plane would get out of hand and crash. In fact, the first week that I was in Fort Myers, we lost an airplane every day because I remember when I got there, the flag was at half-mast, and I asked someone, "What's it at half-mast for?" "Well, we've been losing airplanes." And it was Christmas before anybody got out of a B-26 crash alive. And he lost both his legs to boot.
Now, didn't some of those pilots ask for reassignment? Is that correct?
Yeah, quite a few of them wanted to get out. and they wound up special services and different things, administrative jobs. They just wouldn't fly.
Now, you mentioned one of the pilots down there that you were assigned to really enjoyed flying and kind of close to the ground, right?
Oh, yeah. In fact, we came back to base one day with a branch stuck in one of our wings. And I said, boy, if you think I got to keep flying with you, you're crazy.
You mentioned he liked to chase cows around.
Oh, yeah. Well, some of them who weren't afraid of the airplane, they did all kinds of things. In fact, I can remember on one of the flights, 8,000 feet, he cut the engines. Both engines he cut. And it came down, and he cut them back in when we hit 4,000 feet. And the reason he did it was he wanted to see how fast that airplane would go in a slight dive. And my recollection is that it was faster than any plane I had ever been in up to that time, somewhere around 400 miles an hour.
Wow, and this was the B-26?
B-26, yep.
Now, while you were at Fort Myers, did you get married?
November 24th, 1942.
Your wife came down to...
Yeah, she came down, and talk about changing times. She came down on one day. I had gotten special dispensation, so I didn't have to announce the bands for a few weeks, and I arranged that we get married the day after. But before she got down, I had reserved the hotel room for her and one for me. And we got married the next day. There were only the priest, my best man, and the maid of honor. There were 5 of us in church. Got married, went back to the hotel to have a dinner or whatnot, and I told the desk clerk that we didn't need 2 rooms anymore. We only need 1. He insisted on seeing our marriage license, or he wouldn't let us in. I got a kick out of that.
Times have changed.
Yeah.
And this year he's got a special anniversary coming up, right?
65.
Fantastic.
Imagine that.
Congratulations ahead of time.
Boy.
Now, was she able to stay with you at Fort Myers?
She stayed, and we got orders to head. Well, she stayed, and we thought we were going overseas, but I said, you better go back north, home, and put her on the train. Got orders saying, go to Tampa. We're assigning you to a special unit. And I remember she was in Avon Park on the train when we had messages sent. It was 3 other wives were in the same boat. So we told them, head for Tampa because we're not going overseas now. And we got to Tampa right after the girls did, and they had gotten rooms for us, and we stayed in Tampa a year and a half, operated out of Drew Field there, all over the Gulf and the eastern seaboard.
What type of a mission was this, Jim? What were your particular duties?
Calibrating radar stations. I would note that we're at a certain time, we were at 8,000 feet. The radar should have shown us that we were at that height and where we were. So that's what we were doing. Radar was just coming into its own, and we calibrated the stations.
And this would test your skill as a navigator too, right?
Oh, yeah, it was prescribed courses and altitudes.
And what type of planes were you flying out of Tampa?
You wouldn't believe the forerunner of the B-17, which was a B-35. And we also flew B-25s. And I remember, I don't know why, they stuck me into a dive bomber. There was just a pilot and me. There was some special reason why they did that. I think it was because of the size of the airplane. They wanted to see if they could pick it up without any trouble.
On the radar, you mean?
On the radar.
And that was a little different experience than in the bombers.
Oh, yeah.
The noise you mentioned.
Then I'd get home, and we lived in an apartment on Bayshore Boulevard in Tampa, and I got home and couldn't hear. And my wife was having a fit because I had to turn the radio way up to hear it. But that passed.
And that was from the noise in the
That
dive
was
bomber.
from the noise of the airplane.
And now, how long were you performing this type of duty?
About a year and a half.
And you went somewhere else during this time
Oh,
period
yeah.
for training?
I remember Houston. We went to Washington for some reason. Savannah, different places.
And you mentioned Chanute Field.
Well, I went to Chanute to teach celestial navigation, how to navigate by the stars. They expected me to come back to Tampa and teach classes, but somehow that never materialized because next thing I knew is I had orders to go to Columbia, South Carolina. So we went there and got orders there to head to warm climates. And that's when we headed for the Pacific.
And you left San Francisco?
Yeah, we went to Ogden, Utah, and then to San Francisco, and then boarded a B-24 to head for New Guinea.
And what do you remember the name of the place you landed in New Guinea where you worked out of?
Nadzab, New Guinea. On the way over, we landed in Hawaii, Tarawa, Biak, and Nadzab. And I think I may have mentioned that there was a little captain who originated from New York. There were just the two of us on the plane when they left us in New Guinea. And he stood there and he said, "This is New Guinea." I got a big kick out of that, but there we were, just two guys with two duffel bags, and that's it. So somebody, as I remember, we waited quite a while before somebody came in a truck and picked us up and brought us into the tent area.
And you mentioned that they were short of navigators here in...
Oh, yeah, they evidently were losing planes because they had nobody to direct their courses.
And what were some of your missions here? You mentioned a target area you hit.
Yeah, WEWAC was supposed to be a milk run, you know. You went up and dropped bombs on, it was a Japanese hold out. And we'd do that, and then the next thing I knew, I don't know why, we kept moving up, wound up in Morotai, which is part of the Halmaheras.
Didn't you, you also mentioned to me that you came down with malaria around this time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course, I turned yellow from Atterburn.
Now, where is Morotai?
Well, it's south of the Philippines and north of New Guinea, maybe halfway in between. Mm-hmm. Just a small, small little island. And I should have looked it up, but it didn't. Not far from where we were, there was an island that had a volcano on it. Mm-hmm. I remember using a couple of pints of liquor to get some 50-gallon barrels from the Navy boys, and we built our tent on top of the barrels because the water would come in underneath. And we stayed there long enough to build those tents, and I'm trying to remember what we did for how long there. We weren't there very long, but next thing I knew, we were assigned to Leyte in the Philippines.
Now, what were some of your duties flying out of the Philippines? You mentioned you transported high-ranking officials.
Oh, yeah. We, of course, we had gone to Australia a few times to get supplies. We transported Australian high military men. We transported celebrities who were entertaining the troops, and once in a while, I remember Ed Biermann say, "We gotta go on a bombing run." I said, "Where are you going?" "Well, we'll go to Okinawa or someplace." Sometimes we'd get there and sometimes we wouldn't because he'd turn around either because of weather or the plane wasn't acting right, and we'd go back to the Philippines. Although later on we wound up in Okinawa in a typhoon.
You mentioned you were in the 13th Air Force?
13th Air Force.
And who was the commander of the...
General Paul Wirtsmith.
And he was a pilot also, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, he flew lots of missions in a P-38 when war first started. And I forgot how many missions he had under his belt, but he flew B-17s, and after he flew the fighter planes. And he was the pilot. I think it was Captain Thompson was his co-pilot. And in fact, I think he's in that picture.
We'll see that in a little while.
And
he later on, didn't he? He was something bad happened to him in the States.
Yeah, after the war, I read how he flew from where Selfridge Field in Michigan was flying to South Carolina and crashed, and he got killed.
And you mentioned you went to Palawan one time?
Oh, yeah. That was, I'd go to Zamboanga, to Palawan, to Mindanao. Mindanao, I would pick up fancy Monroe knives that had handles with ivory and silver, and I picked them up as souvenirs and went to Palawan. I forgot why we originally went there to make some kind of arrangements to provide them with oil or gasoline, because I remember the general was there. And the first time I ever saw a black sand beach was Palawan.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember they wanted me to dance with one of the natives. And I said, I'm not a dancer. Anyway, we went to different places in the Philippines. Cebu, beautiful government buildings, look like white marble. We went there, and what we were doing, going to these different places, the general was arranging to trade something for fruit or whatever, and most often it was for gasoline or oil that they needed, or medical supplies. I remember we could buy all kinds of things with Atabrim pills, which we were using for malaria.
Oh, yeah. Now, you mentioned also that you had a particularly favorite pilot that you were friendly with.
Ed Biermann, yeah. And years and years later, somebody from Pittsfield ran into him in Dallas, Texas. And Ed wrote a card to me because he got the address from whoever it was that he met, who evidently knew Pittsfield. So for a few years we corresponded, and then I don't know what happened, but I haven't heard from him in about 4 or 5 years now.
But you were in contact for quite a few years.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in the fall of 45, you were assigned a mission to Okinawa, and you mentioned that you were in a B-25 and you ran into some weather problems.
Oh, boy. If I could have got my hands on that meteorologist, I'd have choked him. Before we took off, we looked at the weather map, and it showed the big swirling. He says it's going due east. Don't worry about it. Well, it was going due west. We flew right into it. Oh, that was scary. And while we were there, we had to worry about Japs infiltrating the camp area.
Right.
Because there were plenty of Japs still on Okinawa.
Now, did you, you couldn't return in the same airplane from Okinawa? Is that correct?
No, we had to come back in a DC-3. I came back as a passenger.
Now, while you were doing all this traveling around the Pacific, were you able to keep in contact with your wife by letters and?
I wrote emails every single day I was overseas. And my wife would tell me, well, they cut this out, they cut that out. And she and I had set up a system where she could tell where I was. And it was latitude and longitude. I would, by the numbers I would write in the letter, she could tell certain numbers were longitude, certain numbers were latitude, and she could look at a map and tell right where I was.
So you worked out your own clever little way of communicating.
Worked it out. I didn't give any secrets away,
No.
but I did tell her where I was.
Well, that's great. Now, in late summer of 45, you flew on another important mission, right? Searching for survivors.
Oh, yeah. One of our duties, I remember, was to see if we could find survivors of the Indianapolis, which had been torpedoed by the Japs. And it was the ship that had transported the A-bomb. So we didn't get any, but some of our other planes found some survivors.
That was a major tragedy.
Oh, yeah. Forgot how many men they lost, quite a few.
Now, were you in the Philippines when the war ended?
Yep. Leyte in the Philippines.
And can you describe some of the celebrating that was going on there?
Well, I still had a couple of pints of bourbon or whatever, and there was a big to-do. The officers' club and the Sixth Fleet was in the bay off a Leyte, and they were really ready for the celebration. This is why I wish I had that book. It showed the fleet shooting fireworks, tracers, everything, and it was the most brilliant exhibition I ever saw of fireworks.
That had to be amazing. I understand there's a picture on the screen now. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's me on the left. To my left facing us is General Wordsmith. The guy on the far right is his co-pilot. I think his name was Thompson, but I wouldn't bet on it. And the man in between the general and the co-pilot, I think, was a medical man. And we were all in the tent celebrating and yakking and watching the fireworks from the Sixth Fleet.
And this is, excuse me, this is the same general that was the commander of the 13th Air Force?
Right. Mm-hmm. Paul Wordsmith.
Quite a guy. Now, eventually you went to Japan, is that correct? After the war?
Yeah, we had to go up there to make some arrangements for the surrender, and we flew into Yokohama, and I don't remember exactly how many days we spent there, but it couldn't have been more than a couple of days that we spent in Japan. Mm-hmm. I remember we'd walk down the street and Japanese would run off the road when they saw us coming, and I took a lot of pictures, which I left to our photo outfit, and I left before they ever showed up. I never did get them.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, the Imperial Palace I took pictures of, and the devastation was unbelievable. So that, and I went to the big Japanese stores, and I bought stuff. I don't remember what exactly, but I did buy a bunch of things from the Japanese, and one of their big department stores, I don't quite remember its name, but it was famous then, and all the clerks spoke English. All Japanese.
This was right after the war.
Yep, and they all spoke English, and I remember trying to buy a Leica camera, which was rated one of the top cameras out, and this Japanese gal says, "You're a little late. We've sold them all."
Now, after this, you went back to the Philippines
Yeah.
for duty. And I know you mentioned before using cigarettes as barter to trade for supplies?
Well, the times we went to Australia, we took cigarettes with us to trade whoever wanted them. In fact, I sold one case, I remember, for something like 700 Australian dollars, which were equivalent to our dollars, and used that money to buy. I bought my daughter a little woolen dress. I bought her a little koala bear. I bought some hand-woven wool that the Aussies had. I bought my wife a sapphire stone, which I later had set in platinum. I bought different things that we were taking home. I remember got back to the Philippines, and one of my buddies there was going home. He'd been over there for 2 or 3 years, and he was going home early. And I gave him the sapphire. I said, he lived in Philadelphia. I said, make sure that this gets to my wife, because if it doesn't, I'm going to come looking for you. He got it to her, and she had it mounted in a platinum setting.
Oh, that's
The
great.
sad part of that is that years later, they broke into our house and stole all that stuff.
Oh.
They stole the ring and my daughter's stuff, and mess.
Oh, that's a shame.
But
Now, eventually, you finally returned to the States, and when was that, Jim?
well, my recollection is that it had to be just before Thanksgiving, because we had 2 Thanksgivings. We crossed the international date line, so we had 2 Thanksgivings, and it took us 31 days to come from Manila to San Francisco
Now, you flew over, but what did you come back on?
on a Liberty ship.
And this was in 1945?
Right.
And you mentioned
December of 45, right?
And where did you land in the United States?
San Francisco.
Now, after landing at San Francisco, where did you go then?
Well, then they made me a train commander, and I had a bunch of guys that I had to account for on the train, and we went from there across the country to Camp Devens.
And what was your rank at this time, Jim?
I was a captain at that time.
And your destination was Fort Devens?
Devens.
And how long were you there at Fort Devens?
Long enough to get a physical, and they said, well, your ears are shot. I said, well, I don't care if they're shot. I'm going home. I'm not staying, because they wanted us to stay for further evaluation. And I said, no, I'll go home. And I'll always remember the railroad depot down at the end of West Street. Got off the train there and went across the road to the Berkshire restaurant. And they were having a big New Year's Eve party. And I met my wife there. And that was it. We were back.
What a great day to get home.
Yep.
Now, what did you do after your discharge? Did you take advantage of the GI Bill?
I went back to law school
And where, Jim?
at Boston University. I had left there in May of 1941, and I got back there in May of 1946.
5 long years.
5 years, right on the nose.
And when did you graduate?
1949
and
from law school.
Law school. And did you eventually start your own law practice?
Yes,
And where was that, Jim?
in Pittsfield.
Now, You told me that you started out alone, but did you eventually end up with partners?
Well, they weren't partners.
Associates?
We were associates. What we did was split the costs of the rental of the offices, the equipment, and so on. So we weren't partners. We were just associates. And I became associated with Frank Simony, who later became a judge, Francis Quirko, who later became a Supreme Court judge after being a Superior Court judge, Clem Ferris, who was also a district court judge, and George Reeder, who sat in as clerk of the Superior Court on occasion. So we had a lot of bigwigs out of that office.
And that was quite unusual, wasn't
Yeah.
it? That many coming out of the same office.
Right.
Now, when did you receive your appointment to the district court?
1973.
And were you able to continue practicing law?
For a few years after that, they allowed us to practice law, but you couldn't practice any criminal law. Civil stuff, small claims, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And that went on until they changed the rules altogether. 1979, no more practice. You couldn't practice. So you had to make a decision whether you were going to stay as a judge or quit. And I chose to stay. Mm-hmm. And stayed until 91.
That's what I was going to ask you. How you served on the bench 18 years then? Amazing. Now, going back a little bit, after your discharge from the Air Force, did you join any veterans organizations or did you remain in the reserves?
I did in Air Corps Reserve, and I don't know how many years I stayed in that. When I got real busy in my practice, then I gave it up, and I was a major in the reserves, and the name of the man who developed Wabika Golf Course, Raoul, had a French name. He's the one that kept me in there for a few years in the reserve because he was very active, and but then I got too busy and I just quit. Somewhere I had a letter saying, since you haven't shown up so many times, we're not considering you a reservist anymore. I should have stayed because some of the other lawyers I knew, they worked strings pretty well. They wound up with a couple weeks in Europe and a couple weeks there.
Well, you had a very interesting career. Now, we're winding it down now, Jim. Probably one more question here. Do you feel that your time in the military had a negative or a positive effect on the rest of your life?
Well, it didn't help, that's for sure. I stop and I think of whether I would have been financially better off if I had just gone through school and gone to work before all this stuff happened. There are some things I could have done without, and I don't think it's being moved from one place to another and developing an attitude towards the movements. In fact, for example, if I moved from one base to another, I was very sure to go to the PX and buy my wife a silver bracelet. She had them all the way up to her elbows. But other than that, I don't think it had a bad effect, but could have done without some of it.
Well, you have a career that you should be proud of, Jim. And I want to
Well-
thank you for coming here this morning, taking the time to come here and talk to us about your life. And I want to thank you for your service to your country and the sacrifices you did make. Thank you, Jim.
Well, I'm glad it's over.